If modern medicine didn't exist, would you be dead right now? If yes, from what?
Mr. Reddit.
Guaranteed, grand mal seizures for 20 years. I was expected to pass away by my 20th, mid-40s now and still cooking.
Appendicitis.
Same here. Appendix burst on Thanksgiving night 2023. Had to be rushed to the hospital for an emergency appendectomy. The surgeon said that there was pus all over my abdominal cavity. Had to spend a week in the hospital with heavy antibiotics and my stomach being constantly pumped and no food or water, just 4 fluids. I would have definitely died without modern medicine.
Same thing with me this past February. Appendix burst, it was 3 times its normal size and almost half necrotized. I was leaking pus, infection, sepsis and MRSA both, and blood clots into my abdominal cavity. Had to be hospitalized 3 times, 3 surgeries, blood transfusion and isolation due to the infections. I was a hot mess. Lost about 50 pounds total over a few months, and most of my muscle. 10 pounds the last 5 days I was in the hospital. Projectile vomiting this green bile that was worse than The Exorcist. I was at a few points where I was just praying to sweet Jesus to end it all, having a drainage tube hanging out of my stomach for like 6 weeks. That's a pain in the ass when trying to shower or simply roll over in bed and it snags on something. My surgeon at a follow-up pulled that damn tube out like he was starting a push lawn mower. I came up from that exam table like F. I was nauseated like I can't even explain. I had no appetite and was always dry heaving. I had to have 6 weeks of home PT because I was too weak to leave the house. The whole ordeal nearly killed me. I am still in shock at how quick it all went down. Edit. A lot of people are asking if I had symptoms, and I actually didn't except some moderate fatigue a few days before it burst. The surgeon was shocked because he said with the size it was, and the fact it had burst and was leaking all this infection led him to believe it had been that way for weeks, if not a few months. Looking back at it all, it was a big blur. My husband told me things I said and did, and I have no memory of. The home health nurses afterwards said that sepsis and MRSA infections can really cause severe confusion and memory loss.
Similar story here. Went to the ER with abdominal pain. The ER doctor completely flubbed the diagnosis. Said I had gas and sent me home, when really my appendix was in the process of rotting inside me. By the time I made it to surgery the next day, my appendix was falling apart. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Had a 7 to 8 inch incision. They gave me lots of morphine. 2 weeks after I was discharged, I began having pain and a fever. The doctors discovered I had an infected abscess. They considered trying to drain it with a big needle, but it was behind my bladder or something, so they needed to operate again. They made the initial incision even longer and made a second incision above that for a drainage tube. After the second surgery, the doctors didn't want to give me morphine, so I was put on some artificial opiate, which I was apparently, it turns out, I am allergic to. I began non-stop vomiting green bile. They stuck a tube down my throat and into my stomach, and for days they were pumping frothy swamp green juice into what looked like an industrial-sized mayonnaise jar beside my bed. I was hospitalized for another 2 weeks, and like you, I lost a ton of weight. This was when I was 16, summer of 1987.
Your story is so similar to mine. I had just gotten married and my wife was still in the process of catching up to moving to Germany with me. I was in the hospital while she was still in transit. Anyway, I went in and they tried a laparoscopic procedure, which was probably wrong, because it has already perforated. I was in the hospital a week with a green bile puke. It was like The Exorcist in there. I could lay in bed and shoot that shit over my feet. Had the nasal gastric tube as well. One of 3 NG tubes I had throughout this saga. When my wife arrived, I was in bed looking like a train wreck with my green juice jar filling up via the aqueduct of my nose. Don't remember if this was before or after nearly shitting myself, but making it only to the trash can and leaving a nice surprise for the staff. Speaking of the staff, they were saints to put up with all this, but The story doesn't end after leaving the hospital after a week. A few days later, I went back in with an infection and an abscess. So, this time, they tell me they're going in laparoscopic again, but they might have to open me up if they're not pleased with what's going on. Well, I woke up gutted like a fish, and they had some sort of spaces in the wound that sort of kept it open. And they were also draining me with a tube hanging out of my side. They would come and snap the tube like a rubber band to keep it draining. That was another week in the hospital, and a few more weeks of recovery at home. When I went in to have my staples out, the med tech was using the staple removing gun, and it fucked up and twisted a staple in my side. She kept trying to use the infernal gun to get it out. I told her to stop and asked if she had tweezers, which she did in this sterile kit. And I started taking this twisted staple out myself. Painlessly, I might add. It was not a great way to start living in Germany or to start a marriage.
Type 1 diabetes. I don't know if you live in the US, but it's really crazy watching here how cheap it is to produce versus how many people are actually dying just from not being able to actually get insulin due to the price it is here. My mother-in-law has told me that she wasn't on Medicare. Her insulin would cost her something like $1,500 a month, and that is an insane number for something that costs so little to produce.
It's an over 100-year-old medicine. How can it possibly cost $1,500 a month? I know the answer is greed, but still. Fun fact, the creator of insulin sold the patent for $1 because he thought it was too important to be behind a paywall. You could put a couple of magnets by his grave and power the entire northern hemisphere with how much spinning he must be doing in there.
Same, when I turned 18, I moved out of my mom's place and cut contact. Bad home life. I was overconfident and thought I had money saved up to buy insulin without insurance until I got a job. I did not have enough money saved up. I take 2 insulins, short and long acting, and the total was over $500, almost $600. Didn't have a credit card yet and I needed my cash stores to rent an apartment. GoodRx wasn't around yet, this was ages ago. I had to run across the street and take out a sketchy payday loan for 1 month of insulin. Later on, I got a job, got insurance, eventually paid it off after a year. The loan total, plus ungodly interest, was well over the initial price tag, lol. But that scared the shit out of me, especially as a teen trying to make a better life for myself. Feels like I'm paying a premium just to live by no fault of my own. When the pharmacy tech read off the price tag, I really thought about trying to make it a month without insulin. Now that I think about it, if I did that, I probably would have died. After getting settled in, I locked in. I went on to become an EMT, got my bachelor's in physiology, worked as a paramedic for a couple years, then shifted gears and got into medical school. We'll be going into emergency medicine. I'm so proud that I help so many more people compared to what our health system does, but imagine if I did die. I can't keep count of how many people I've treated so far, definitely in the hundreds. At the end of my career, it'll be multiple thousands. Crazy to think about, deny, defend, depose and all that.
Stage 4 cancer. Over 3 years still fighting. But without modern medicine, the giant tumor on my tongue would have choked off my airway or starved me to death within a few months.
Yes. I was born with my intestines out of my body. Until the fetus grows large enough to house the intestines, they're outside in purpose and then slowly get tugged back in as the fetus grows. Sometimes the getting tugged back in part goes astray.
I was born with birth asphyxia. I was delivered via C-section. I had a staph infection when I was very little and there was a time where I literally became psychotic, so it's pretty safe to say that without modern medicine I would be in the soil. I was born with birth asphyxia. I was delivered via C-section. I had a staph infection when I was very little and there was a time where I literally became psychotic, so it's pretty safe to say that without modern medicine I would be in the soil.
Absolutely. From childbirth. We almost died. Had an emergency C-section.
Likewise. Preeclampsia, blood pressure through the roof. Needed urgent medication, then induction, we'd both be dead a century ago. Even half a century.
I almost lost a friend to this in the early 90s. 22, healthy, vegetarian, athletic, non-smoker, did everything right, and yet her first pregnancy almost killed her for real. It was her last pregnancy too. She loves her son, but she's fine with him being an only child, because she wants to live.
I have a brother who was born severely O2 deprived, and he has very high special needs now. People who have home births do not understand that when things go wrong for the mom baby, you have 10 seconds? 30? A minute? Let's go crazy and say 10 minutes. What you don't have is time to get into a car, go to the hospital, or even wait 3-10 minutes for an ambulance, then get to the hospital and get into the OR. They just don't even understand. My old BF was an anesthesiologist. He said babies were the scariest because their system were so tiny. When things went wrong, then went wrong fast. He said after that it was moms giving birth, because they are so vascular, so much blood can evacuate so quickly, you need all of the resources of the hospital right there immediately, and I will never ever ever forget that. Kind of thing you only need to hear once.
My wife and daughter nearly died during childbirth. Wife lost significant amounts of blood and daughter was born with extremely low blood sugar. If we hadn't had such amazing doctors that reacted immediately, I would have gone home alone with an empty car seat to an unused baby room. Still gives me nightmares 15 years down the road.
I was one of those babies born in 1980. My pediatrician was pissed when he saw me. My mama's anesthesiologist was on shift way too many hours and gave her 2 epidurals and saddle blocks versus 1 because the line was kinked. When he untwisted it, she got it all at once. She doesn't remember me being born. Her respiration dropped to next to nothing. I kept flipping face down, so my face was riding down her spine. The doctor flipped me 5 or 6 times and was angry I kept flipping back. So I was pulled out by my face with forceps. At the age of 2, I started having seizures, ironically on my birthday, as I would go to sleep on my stomach. The seizures wouldn't stop until I was in the hospital and doped out of my mind on Valium.
Thanks for spreading awareness. My ex-in-laws have a family friend whose son was oxygen deprived because labor was taking too long and the doctor should have done an emergency C-section, but for whatever reason didn't want to. When I was in labor with my first, I had state insurance, and there were only midwives treating me. After 13 hours of labor and 6 hours of pushing after my water broke, I was so worried. They kept saying, "You're almost there. We see his head." Until I was finally like, "Get me a doctor." And she said, "I really think you'd get me a doctor now." Doctor came in, tried the vacuum and it didn't work, recommended surgery.
This happened to my sister, and I don't think my mother has ever gotten over it. I don't know so much about how it happens, but my sister has high needs and is perhaps also autistic. Do you have a name for your brother's condition?
Okay, it's called something really long. They used to called it CP with something else, but now it's called HI, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, because while he is uncoordinated, he has most of his gross motor function, just not a lot of fine motor function. He has a lot of emotional outbursts he can't read. There is so much intellectual disability, it's really hard.
The panic in the room was very intense when my son was born. Wife unconscious from blood loss, son floppy and blue, everything happening at the same time and no time for explanation. All I could do was stand by and watch. I kept thinking they know what to do, and they were successful. After getting the explanation, they could have both died in front of me really fast. Like, at one point they were both unconscious and almost dead. Really crazy to think about. 11 years here, crying like crazy reading your comment. Our son was fine, but that moment of being pushed into the corner of the room by all the staff that came in with the crash cart and thinking I was watching my wife bleed to death in front of me will always haunt me.
Luckily the crash cart wasn't needed, but it was close enough. They managed to stop the bleeding in time, but she looked gray, didn't move anymore. If it wasn't for the heart rate monitor she was hooked up to, I would have been sure she was gone. It's not something you can forget, I think. Did she come out all okay?
Complete placenta previa here. Not the kind that moves out of the way. They had to call in a specialist to stitch the inside of my uterus back together afterward because it wouldn't quit bleeding. To certain people in this country, it's pretty obvious which one think women should just carry their unwanted pregnancies to term. I don't have to tell everyone in this thread that there are very real and very bad outcomes for some pregnancies, and no one should be expected to risk that shit unless they damn well want to, especially when we also suck at providing the necessary healthcare at an affordable cost for many of those outcomes. After going through a hellscape pregnancy, I am even more pro-choice than I was before.
One of my former patients had an asthma attack at a sporting event. Because of the venue and crowd size, they couldn't get to her rescue inhaler soon enough. She had left it in her car. Her airway closed, she suffered massive brain damage. She doesn't know she's alive, for all intents and purposes she died that day. Her family put in a feeding tube, trach, ventilator, and she's still here, 15 years later. She can't speak, move, or interact in any way. Her muscles have atrophied and her existence is my greatest fear. Some things truly are worse than death, and modern medicine prolongs death in some rare instance when it really is a mercy. It's why I felt the need to share that under your comment about asthma, maybe because some people downplay it instead of recognizing it for the life-threatening condition that it is.
I have gone to people's houses and they might have pets or something that triggers me and I literally cannot breathe and I sound like I'm doing the death rattle. They don't take it seriously because they think it's just like being out of breath after a run. I also think it's shocking how, in the UK, meds for asthma aren't free like they are for diabetics. I've had to ring 999 3 times this year. I live alone and it's fucking scary because it's not only not being able to breathe, I can't move, the room spins, I can't walk, I feel sick, I literally feel like I'm going to collapse or die. I think because so many people have asthma, or claim to, and the majority have only mild symptoms, people don't really take it seriously.
Hate to be political, but it's amazing how when we put down an animal, it's described as the most humane thing you can do, but when it's an actual human, we leave them to suffer this way. It's absolutely horrid and I'd hope if I ever ended up this way, my family would know better than to force me to go on.
Wow. I've never even considered that a possibility. I almost died when I was 5, but the good OL nebulizer and steroids and whatever else saved me. Scary to think I could have ended up like that as an alternative, without being disrespectful, and it sounds awful I know, but I'd honestly rather die than end up in that state. I've told my family, please try end me without getting locked up if I become brain damaged. That's no life at all.
Thank you all for watching. If you are interested, subscribe and watch other videos.